Hello, and welcome to Textbook Reading and Note-Taking. My name is Sarah Call. I'm the Academic Success and Retention Specialist here at Upper Iowa University. Let's get started. So right off the bat here, the first three things you'll want to do when you're reading are identifying important information from the text, practicing strategies to retain the information, and being strategic in your reading. So identify how you're going to be assessed based on that reading. A little bit more about assessment. So assessment is basically the fancy term for testing or kind of seeing if you've met those learning outcomes that your instructor has set for the chapter, unit, span of time, whatever. So different ways you could be assessed are like multiple choice tests, short answer tests, evaluation of data in labs, class discussions, class presentations, essays, and papers. So thinking about how might you read knowing how you'll be assessed. For example, if you know that you have a test coming up and it's multiple choice, maybe you'll kind of want to focus more on facts and definitions and those items versus say you have an essay, you'll want to understand broader concepts and how pieces fit together. So two habits for textbook reading are one, reading daily. So making it a habit and planning ahead and being consistent with your reading. It doesn't have to be a 3-hour stretch of time that you're reading. Maybe you set aside a half hour a day to do some reading for a particular course. And second, be an active reader. So it's not just opening your book and reading words and closing your book. It's writing notes, summarizing what you've read, making flashcards, engaging with whatever it is you're reading at the time. So a little bit more on that. Don't read your textbooks like you'd read a newspaper. For example, reading backwards. So, you open up your textbook chapter and first thing you're going to do is look at chapter summaries, vocab lists, diagrams, bolded items, stuff like that. Writing down some questions. So maybe you could reword subheadings as questions. You'll want to pay attention to the formatting of the text. So like I previously mentioned, bolded items, italicized, whatever the format of the book itself is done to make certain things stand out. You'll want to make notes in the margins. If you don't own the book or it's a digital book, the digital ones, you can use those like highlighting. Some apps have them. Some of them have little note flag things you can put in there too. For physical books, if you don't own the book, you could get some sticky notes. They also have those little tab things that don't damage books if it's a rental. And then making sure that you're putting information that you read into your own words. So think about what that information that you just read means to you. Write it down in a way that makes sense to you. And honestly, relating it to a personal experience, if you have one, will help you remember it the most. So you're probably wondering why we don't think you should be highlighting things. It can become a very passive way to read. Many people will highlight too much of the page. So we kind of see over here in this image, this person has highlighted every single word in line. So highlighting can make you think the rest of the text is not important. So instead of highlighting, maybe write down page numbers in your notes or use those little sticky flags so you can return to that information later. Next, we're going to talk about the SQ4R reading strategy. So first up, you'll survey the chapter. So a couple slides ago, we talked a little bit about this, looking at headers, kind of just glancing through it, flipping through it, see what's important, what's it about, getting a general sense of what's going to happen. Writing down questions for the headings or just any questions you have, maybe even before reading the chapter. Next is when you get into that reading part. So reading the information one paragraph at a time, or you can break it down further one sentence at a time, whatever works best for you, but basically take it bit by bit. After that, recite the important information from whatever it is you just read. So maybe that's putting into your own words. I've also seen this listed as record. So maybe that's writing down some of that information of what's important from that section that you just read. Next, summarize and relate back to what you already know. So, okay, this is what I just read. How does it relate to the broader topic, or how does it relate to something we previously learned in class? And then at the end, just reviewing that again. And maybe it's also reviewing, previous chapter notes that you've done with this strategy, but taking time to review is very important when it comes to learning and studying and reading. So here we have an example of active reading. So this person here, day one, they've taken some time to write down their questions in either the margins or a notebook for the main points. Day two, they've taken some time to kind of look through what they did on day one. And we see here that they've kind of made themselves some tools for studying and reading. So they've made flashcards, they've done some self-testing based on those questions that they've written down. They've developed mnemonic devices for material that needs to be memorized. So, maybe it's remembering that leaves are green and green is the color of money, and that's why the stock market's important, or something along those lines. Making those connections that you understand, or using acronyms even, works just as well. So days 3, 4, and 5, this person here is continuing with the steps they did on day 2. So, testing themselves. Maybe they're making some additional flashcards if necessary, if a certain concept or word isn't sticking. That's the other thing too, with whatever you do, whatever system you use, making sure you're evaluating whether it's working for you. And if it's not, okay, how can it be updated? And then we see here on the weekend, they're making a table of contents and studying, or making a study sheet to recite information orally and in their own words. So they've made a week-long schedule of how they're going to actively read this subject and how they're going to master the information within whatever it is they just read. So next we're going to talk about some note-taking methods. There is a video if you want to pause, type this link into your browser. It's a little nerdy, but the guy makes some good points, and we'll kind of talk about ahead of the next few slides, the note-taking methods he references. So first up, we have the outline method. So this way of note-taking, we see here that there's a main point or a heading, topic, and then below those topics are subtopics, which are then even broken down further into bullet points. So this is a good way to organize things in a very linear fashion, if that's your style. Next is the Cornell note-taking system. So here we have, they've sectioned off the page into 3 distinct parts. Here is where the notes happen. So they're main bullet points, diagrams, words, whatever. Down here is a summary that they've written for that page of notes. And then over here are cues. So maybe you'd write these after class. It can be related to anticipated exam questions, main ideas, vocab words, or even just questions that maybe the professor asked, like, okay, how many legs does a dog have? And at this point, you're over here like, oh, we talked about how dogs are quadrupeds and they have 4 legs. Just those cues to kind of help you also remember what is the context for whatever it is you've written over here. Next up is the mind map method. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's very good if you're a visual thinker and don't like things to be so linear like the Cornell method or the outline method. So the mind map, you have your central concept here, and you're branching out in whatever way you feel. Maybe it's over here with keywords, it branches out. This is really, really good if you're trying to generate ideas. I myself have never used this in taking notes for a subject, so I'd be curious to hear about how that goes for some folks. But yeah, it's wonderful for idea generating. Next, we have the flow method. So the flow method is a little even less defined than the mind map method. Instead, you are writing things on the page however you see fit in a way that makes sense to you to remember it. So maybe you're writing in a little bit of that outline method, but maybe you're putting, sidebar items, or maybe you're drawing circles and arrows. It's really whatever you feel like your page needs to look like. Again, this method isn't for everybody, but I know for people such as myself, this would work well because I know I have a brain that tends to like things a little more free form and not linear. So you just got to use whichever one you feel is best for you. Lastly, everybody's favorite, the write on the slides method. So if you have access to your course, like if your instructor uses a slideshow, if they can provide you with that, if they put that somewhere before class, printing it off and then bringing it with you. And then as they're lecturing, you have the slides as kind of cues and context similar to the Cornell method. And then also your own notes over here. So some people call it the lazy man's way of taking notes. If it works for you, it works for you, and there is no shame in that. So just taking a couple minutes to reflect, think about one of your current courses and what note-taking method might be the most effective for that course and why. And then the other one being, what is something you learned about textbook reading that you are going